single candle. That's what started the unraveling of one of America's most horrifying medical secrets. On the night of October 3, 1889, a kitchen fire at Riverside Manor in Natchez, Mississippi, consumed the east wing of what had once been a thriving cotton plantation. When firefighters tore down a smoke-damaged wall in the old servants' quarters, they discovered something that had been sealed behind bricks for 37 years. A leather medical case. Inside were 25 glass vials, each containing what appeared to be preserved tissue samples. Each vial was labeled with a number, a date from 1851 and 1852, and a single word that made the fire chief's blood run cold. Failed. But it was what else they found that would shake the foundations of American medicine. Wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath the vials was a stack of daguerreotype photographs. 25 faces. Men, women, some barely old enough to be called adults. All of them black. All of them staring into the camera with expressions that ranged from confusion to outright terror. And written on the back of each photograph in the same neat handwriting that labeled the vials were notes. Clinical observations about organ function, surgical procedures, and time of death. The fire chief, a man named Robert Caldwell who had served in the Union Army and thought he'd seen the worst of what humans could do to each other, sat on the smoke-stained floor and wept. What they had discovered was evidence of something that defied comprehension. A systematic program of medical experimentation conducted in secret, where a physician had attempted to transplant animal organs into living human beings. 25 attempts, 25 deaths, 0 survivors. And the most disturbing part, local authorities had known. They had known, and they had done nothing to stop it. The physician's name was Dr. Nathaniel Grisham, and by the time his crimes were discovered, he had been dead for 23 years. But the people he experimented on, the 25 souls who suffered under his scalpel in the name of science, their story had been buried with deliberate precision. Until that candle fell, until those bricks came down, until the truth, preserved in glass vials and photographic images, could no longer be hidden. This is the story of what happened at Riverside Manor between January 1851 and November 1852. This is the story of 25 people whose names were recorded only as numbers in a madman's notes. And this is the story of how an entire community conspired to keep that madness secret for nearly 4 decades. Before we go deeper into this darkness, before we examine what Dr. Nathaniel Grisham did in his private surgical room and why no one stopped him, I need to ask you something. If you're drawn to these buried chapters of history, these stories that reveal the depths of human cruelty hidden beneath the surface of respectability, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell, because what you're about to hear is just one of many horrifying truths that America tried to forget. And drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Are you in Mississippi? Have you ever heard whispers of this story? I want to know. Now let's go back to 1850, to understand not just what happened, but how a man could convince himself that what he was doing was righteous, how a society could enable such horror, and how 25 people could vanish into an experimental nightmare without the world noticing or caring. Natchez, Mississippi in 1850 was a city of contradictions so stark they seemed almost designed to showcase American hypocrisy. The city sat on bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, its mansions gleaming white in the southern sun, its streets lined with magnolias and the scent of wealth so thick you could taste it. This was one of the richest cities in America, built entirely on cotton and the enslaved labor that made that cotton profitable. More millionaires lived in Natchez than in any other American city of comparable size. But that wealth came with a price paid in human suffering that the wealthy did their best to ignore. Into this world came Dr. Nathaniel Grisham in the spring of 1850. He arrived by steamboat from New Orleans, carrying with him trunks full of medical texts, a degree from a French medical school that would later prove to be partially forged, and a vision that he claimed would revolutionize surgery. He was 41 years old, a widower who never spoke of his late wife except to say she had died of kidney failure, and he was consumed by a singular obsession. The human body's organs, he believed, could be replaced like parts in a machine. Diseased organs could be removed and healthy ones installed in their place. The fact that this had never been successfully accomplished, that it existed only in the realm of theory and speculation, didn't deter him. It drove him. Grisham's credentials were impressive enough to gain him entry into Natchez's medical society. His French education, his published papers on organ disease, His eloquent descriptions of theoretical surgical procedures, all of it painted a picture of a dedicated physician at the forefront of medical innovation. What people didn't know, what wouldn't be discovered until decades later, was that Grisham had been quietly expelled from 2 hospitals in Europe. Not for incompetence, but for what his colleagues delicately termed excessive experimental enthusiasm with terminal patients. He had attempted procedures without consent, pushed boundaries that even the relatively loose medical ethics of the 1840s found unacceptable, and showed a disturbing lack of empathy for patient suffering. But in Natchez, with no one to contradict his carefully constructed history, Grisham was welcomed as a man of science. Within 6 months, he had established a modest practice treating the city's white elite. He was skilled enough to be useful, diagnosing ailments correctly and prescribing treatments that generally worked. But his real interest wasn't in treating the wealthy. His real interest lay in the surgical possibilities that came with the South's peculiar institution. In November 1850, Grisham purchased Riverside Manor, a cotton plantation 8 miles north of Natchez that had fallen on hard times. The previous owner, a man who had drunk himself into debt and an early grave, had left the property mortgaged and neglected. The plantation came with 130 acres of cotton fields, a main house that needed significant repair, various outbuildings, and 43 enslaved people ranging in age from 6 to 63. Grisham paid cash, surprising the creditors who had expected the property to languish unsold for months. What surprised the enslaved community at Riverside even more was what Grisham did next. He announced he had no interest in cotton cultivation. The fields would be left fallow. The plantation would instead serve as his private medical research facility. The enslaved people would be responsible for maintaining the buildings and grounds, serving the household, and he said this with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, contributing to medical advancement. What that contribution would entail, he didn't specify, but he immediately began renovating one of the outbuildings, a former tobacco barn that sat at the edge of the property, partially hidden by a stand of oak trees. He had workers, white laborers from Natchez who were paid handsomely and told to ask no questions, transform the building according to specifications he had drawn with obsessive precision. The barn's interior was gutted and rebuilt as a medical facility. One large room served as a surgical theater, with windows positioned to capture maximum natural light. Adjoining it was a recovery room with 6 beds, each bed fitted with leather restraints. And on the far end, connected by a covered walkway, was a structure that puzzled the workers. A series of pens and enclosures clearly designed for housing large animals. One worker, a carpenter named Thomas Wickham, later testified that he had questioned the design. Why would a doctor need animal pens connected to a surgical theater? Grisham's answer was smooth and reasonable. He would be studying animal anatomy to better understand human physiology. Comparative anatomy, he called it, a respected field of medical research. Wickham accepted the explanation because Grisham was educated, well-spoken, and carried the authority that came with being a physician and a property owner. To question him further would have been presumptuous. By January 1851, the renovations were complete. Grisham began stocking his facility with equipment. Surgical instruments imported from France and Germany. Chloroform for anesthesia, though as events would reveal he used it sparingly and not always with the patient's comfort in mind. Chemicals for preserving tissue samples, and animals. He purchased them through dealers in New Orleans, selecting them with specific criteria. Young, healthy specimens, 2 horses, 4 pigs of varying sizes, 6 sheep, 3 goats, and, most unusually, 2 chimpanzees that had been brought to America by a traveling menagerie that had gone bankrupt. The enslaved community at Riverside watched all of this with growing unease. They had lived under brutal overseers before, had endured hardships that would break most people, but there was something different about Dr. Grisham. He didn't rage or beat. He simply observed. He would walk through the quarters with a small notebook, watching people work, watching them eat, watching them interact. He would stop occasionally to ask questions. How old are you? Any illnesses in your family? Do you experience shortness of breath? Pain in your abdomen? The questions seemed medical, even caring, but there was something in his eyes that made people want to disappear. One person saw through Grisham's veneer of respectability immediately. His name was Isaac, and he was 61 years old that January. Isaac had been born free in Virginia, kidnapped at age 12 and sold into slavery. He had spent 49 years in bondage, and in that time he had developed an ability to read white men that went beyond their words. He understood their intentions, their capacity for cruelty, the subtle signs that preceded violence. And what he read in Nathaniel Grisham terrified him more than any overseer he'd ever known. "That man is broken inside," Isaac told his son Marcus one cold January evening. They were sitting by a small fire in the quarters, speaking in voices too low to carry. "I seen cruel men. I seen men who enjoy hurting people. But this one different. He look at us like we already dead, like we just bodies waiting for him to use us." Marcus was 34 years old, strong from years of field work, and he had a wife named Sarah and 2 daughters. He wanted to believe his father was being overly cautious. "Maybe he just odd, Papa. Some doctors are peculiar." "Don't mean he planning harm?" Isaac shook his head slowly. "I've been alive long enough to trust what my bones tell me. And my bones telling me that barn he built, them animals he bought, that notebook he carries, it all adding up to something terrible. We need to be careful, need to watch out for each other. Because that man, he hunting." Isaac's instincts would prove horrifyingly accurate. On January 15, 1851, Dr. Grisham called his overseer, a man named Luther Briggs, who had agreed to work for him despite the strange nature of the job, into his study. Grisham handed Briggs a list with 5 names on it. Each name was accompanied by notes: age, general health, observed symptoms or weaknesses. "I need these individuals moved to the medical facility," Grisham said, his tone casual as if he were requesting supplies. "Tell them they've been selected for treatment. Free medical care for their ailments. Presented as good fortune." Briggs looked at the list. The first name was Hannah, a woman of 38 who had been complaining of persistent headaches. The second was a young man named Elijah, 22, who had a slight limp from an old injury. 3 others followed, each with some minor health complaint that Grisham had apparently been cataloging. "And if they don't want to come?" Briggs asked, though he already knew the answer. Grisham smiled. It was a cold expression, more habit than emotion. "Mr. Briggs, they're property. Their preferences are irrelevant. Bring them to the facility. I'll handle the rest." That conversation, later reconstructed from Briggs's testimony during the investigation, marked the beginning of what would become 25 deaths over the next 22 months. Briggs claimed he didn't know what Grisham intended. He insisted he believed the doctor was genuinely planning to treat sick slaves, perhaps test new medicines. He said he had no idea that the medical facility was actually a chamber of horrors where Grisham would attempt procedures that defied all medical ethics and human decency. Whether Briggs was telling the truth or simply protecting himself from prosecution would never be fully determined. What matters is that on January 16, 1851, Hannah became the first person taken to Grisham's surgical theater. She was told she would receive treatment for her headaches. She was given a cup of liquid that contained a mild sedative, and when she became drowsy and compliant, she was strapped to the surgical table. What happened next was documented in Grisham's notes that would be discovered along with those glass vials and photographs 38 years later. His handwriting was neat, his observations clinical, his complete absence of moral consciousness chilling. Subject 1, female, approximately 38 years of age, he wrote. Patient presence with chronic cephalgia, recurring headaches of unknown origin. Hypothesis: deficiency in cranial blood flow may be addressed through enhancement of cardiovascular function. Procedure: transplantation of cardiac tissue from juvenile sheep to supplement patient's existing heart function. The language was designed to sound scientific, but what it described was butchery. Grisham opened Hannah's chest cavity while she was conscious. The chloroform he administered was insufficient, either by accident or by design. He had spent months studying sheep anatomy, and he attempted to graft pieces of a sheep's heart onto Hannah's existing heart, believing that the additional tissue would somehow enhance her cardiovascular function and, in his twisted logic, improve blood flow to her brain. The procedure took 3 hours. Hannah died on the table at approximately 11 o'clock that night. The cause of death was listed in Grisham's notes as acute cardiac failure, excessive hemorrhaging, and apparent tissue rejection. But even in documenting his failure, Grisham showed no remorse. His final note on subject 1 read, "Procedure unsuccessful. Patient expired before tissue integration could be assessed." Conclusion: faster surgical technique required. Younger subjects may demonstrate superior recovery capacity. Research continues. Hannah's body was buried that same night in a grave dug at the far edge of the plantation property, beyond the oak trees, in soil that Grisham had designated for what he called medical waste disposal. Briggs supervised the burial, and the next morning he told the enslaved community that Hannah had died from complications related to her headaches, despite Dr. Grisham's best efforts to save her. No one believed the lie. But no one could challenge it either. To question a white man's account meant punishment or death, so the community absorbed the loss in silence, adding Hannah's name to the long list of people who had died under slavery's brutal machinery. They didn't yet understand that Hannah's death wasn't random tragedy. It was the first step in a systematic program of human experimentation that would claim 24 more lives. Isaac knew, though. When he heard about Hannah's death, when he saw Grisham emerge from the medical facility the next morning with bloodstains on his boots despite having changed his clothes, when he noticed that one of the sheep pens was now empty, Isaac understood. The hunting had begun. "We got to survive this," he told his family that night. "Whatever that man doing in that barn, whoever he picks next, we got to find a way to survive until something stops him. Because he ain't gonna stop himself. But how do you survive when you have no power, no legal protection, no way to escape, and no one who will listen to your warnings?" That question would haunt the people of Riverside for the next 22 months, as Dr. Nathaniel Grisham refined his technique, selected his subjects, and methodically killed 24 more people in pursuit of a surgical achievement that was scientifically impossible with 1851 medical knowledge. The second subject was taken on January 20th, 4 days after Hannah's death. His name was Elijah, the 22-year-old with the limp from an old injury. Grisham had observed him for weeks, noting in his records that despite the injury, Elijah appeared to have excellent overall health. Strong, young, with no apparent diseases, Grisham had decided that his first failure might have resulted from choosing a subject with pre-existing health problems. He needed someone healthy to rule out that variable. Elijah was told he would receive treatment for his leg. Revolutionary techniques from Europe, Grisham explained, that could repair old injuries. Elijah was skeptical, but he was also 22 years old and tired of limping. He allowed himself to hope. That hope walked him into the surgical theater on the evening of January 20th. It strapped him to the table. It kept him calm even as Grisham prepared instruments that looked more suited to a slaughterhouse than a hospital. Grisham's notes on Subject 2 reveal the evolution of his twisted methodology. Male, approximately 22 years, excellent physical condition aside from previous leg injury. Hypothesis: transplantation of kidney tissue from healthy pig may enhance overall systemic function and potentially improve healing capacity. Proceeding with right kidney removal and replacement with porcine equivalent. What Grisham was attempting had no basis in medical science. He didn't understand immunology, tissue rejection, blood types, or the fundamental incompatibility between species. He was operating on theories he had constructed in isolation, theories that had no peer review, no testing, no foundation in reality. And he was testing those theories on human beings who had no choice, no consent, and no hope of survival. Elijah lasted longer than Hannah. He survived the surgery itself, though he never regained full consciousness. He died 19 hours later, his body rejecting the foreign tissue in ways that Grisham documented with clinical fascination. The notes described swelling, fever, the shutdown of organ systems. And at the end, the same conclusion: failure. Subject expired before successful tissue integration. Note: age and health of subject appeared optimal. Failure may indicate incompatibility at cellular level. Further research required. 2 deaths in 5 days. 2 bodies buried in unmarked graves. And Grisham was just getting started. The pattern that would characterize the next 22 months began to establish itself. Every 4 to 6 days, Grisham would select another subject. His criteria evolved with each failure, but certain themes remained constant. He preferred younger subjects, theorizing that youth meant better recovery potential. He chose people who appeared healthy, eliminating the variable of pre-existing disease, and he varied his procedures, attempting different types of organ transplants, different donor animals, different surgical techniques, kidneys, pieces of liver, lung tissue, sections of intestine, even attempts at replacing major blood vessels with animal equivalents. Each procedure ended the same way: death. Sometimes within hours, Sometimes after days of suffering in the recovery room, the bodies were buried. The community was told that the person had died from medical complications despite Dr. Grisham's best efforts. And Grisham would return to his notes, analyzing what went wrong, planning how to refine his approach for the next attempt. By March 1851, 8 people had died. The enslaved community at Riverside was paralyzed by a terror that went beyond anything they had experienced before. Slavery was brutal, filled with daily horrors and constant degradation. But this was different. This was systematic selection, like watching a predator pick off members of a herd one by one. People began hiding any sign of illness or injury, terrified that showing weakness would make them targets. Parents kept their children quiet and invisible, hoping that Grisham wouldn't notice them. The elderly prayed they would be overlooked, and everyone watched that medical facility with dread, knowing that the lamplight burning in its windows after dark meant someone was dying. Isaac became Subject 9 on March 18, 1851. The old man who had warned everyone, who had seen through Grisham from the beginning, was selected precisely because of his age. Grisham's notes reveal a chilling logic. Subject 9, male, approximately 61 years. Advanced age presents opportunity to test hypothesis regarding tissue compatibility in elderly subjects. Previous failures may relate to metabolic rates in younger subjects. Proceeding with hepatic tissue transplantation using porcine liver sections. Isaac knew what was coming when Luther Briggs appeared at his door that evening. He had watched 8 people taken to that building. None had returned. He looked at his son Marcus, at his grandchildren, and he made a decision. He would go without resistance. He would preserve what dignity remained available to a man who had spent 49 years in chains. But he would also try to bear witness in the only way left to him. As they walked toward the medical facility, Isaac spoke to Briggs. His voice was steady, almost conversational. "Mr. Briggs, you know what's happening in that building. You know Dr. Grisham ain't healing nobody. You're gonna have to live with that knowledge. You're gonna have to carry it the rest of your days." Briggs, according to his later testimony, said nothing. He opened the door to the surgical theater and watched Isaac walk inside. The old man was strapped to the table at approximately 8 o'clock that evening. He died at 4:37 the next morning, having survived 8 hours post-surgery. His last recorded words, documented by Grisham with what reads as irritation rather than reflection, were, "God's gonna judge you for this." Grisham's response in his notes was revealing. Subject 9 demonstrated excessive verbalization during preparation phase, requiring additional sedation. Elderly subjects may prove unsuitable due to reduced physiological resilience and apparent psychological resistance to procedures. Isaac's death broke something in the community at Riverside. His son Marcus, who had tried to believe his father was being overly cautious, who had wanted to think the situation wasn't as dire as it seemed, understood now that there would be no rescue, no intervention, no justice. They were entirely at the mercy of a man who had no mercy to give. Marcus gathered a small group of trusted people 2 nights after his father's burial. 6 men ranging in age from 26 to 53. They met in the darkness behind the cotton gin, speaking in whispers, discussing options that ranged from desperate to suicidal. "We could run," suggested a man named Daniel, 31, who worked as a blacksmith. "All of us. Take everyone who can travel and run north." "With 40 people?" Marcus replied, his voice heavy with the weight of impossible choices. "With children and elders? We wouldn't make it 20 miles before the patrols caught us, and everyone who got caught would be killed or sold away. Can't save everyone by getting everyone killed. We could burn that building," another man named Thomas offered. "Burn it while he's sleeping in there. And this. And they'd hang every man here for murder of a white property owner," Marcus said. "Our families would be sold. Everything would get worse. We burn that building. We just trade one horror for another." The conversation circled through options that all led to the same conclusion. They were trapped. Trapped by law, by geography, by the fundamental structure of a society that didn't recognize them as human beings with rights worth protecting. The only realistic strategy was survival. Stay invisible when possible. Stay strong when you couldn't be invisible. And pray that something, anything, would eventually stop Grisham. But Grisham had no intention of stopping. His journal from March and April 1851 reveals a mind descending further into obsession. The repeated failures weren't discouraging him. They were refining his approach. He began keeping more detailed records, measuring everything. body temperature, pulse rate, breathing patterns. He took daguerreotype photographs of each subject before the procedures, creating a visual record that would later prove crucial to identifying his victims. And he started preserving tissue samples in those glass vials, creating what he called a comprehensive library of transplant rejection responses. The photographs are particularly disturbing. In each image, the subject stands or sits before the camera, often looking confused or frightened. Some appear to have been told to smile. Others stare at the lens with expressions of profound resignation. Behind each person, you can see part of the surgical theater. The table with its leather straps visible in the background like a promise of what was coming. Subject 10 was a woman named Rachel, 26 years old, who had been selected because, as Grisham noted, female subjects may demonstrate different rejection patterns than male subjects due to physiological variations. Rachel was married to one of the men in Marcus's group. She had 3 children under the age of 8. She was taken on March 24th and died on March 25th, surviving only 11 hours after Grisham attempted to transplant sheep lung tissue into her chest cavity. Her husband, a man named Samuel, wanted to die after that. Marcus had to physically restrain him from attacking Grisham in broad daylight, an act that would have resulted in Samuel's immediate execution and likely reprisals against his children. "Your babies need you breathing," Marcus told him as Samuel sobbed with rage and grief. "Rachel wouldn't want you to leave them orphaned. We got to survive this. We got to." But survival felt less possible with each passing week. By May 1851, 13 people had died. The plantation's population had dropped from 43 to 30. The loss was too significant to hide completely, and questions began reaching Natchez. Why was Riverside experiencing such dramatic mortality? Plantations saw death, certainly, but 13 deaths in 4 months was extraordinary even by the brutal standards of that institution. The questions reached Dr. Edmund Cartwright, the president of the Natchez Medical Society, and a physician who had initially welcomed Grisham to the community. Cartwright was not an abolitionist. He owned enslaved people himself and saw nothing wrong with the institution. But he did have professional standards, and he had begun hearing troubling rumors about Grisham's research facility. Cartwright visited Riverside in mid-May, announcing his arrival in advance as professional courtesy required. This gave Grisham 3 days to prepare. He cleaned the surgical theater obsessively. He moved the animals to a barn on the far side of the property where they wouldn't be immediately visible. He hid his most damning notes, though he kept them rather than destroying them because he believed, with the arrogance common to men who've convinced themselves they're ahead of their time, that history would eventually vindicate his work. When Cartwright arrived on May 18th, he was given a carefully curated tour. The medical facility appeared to be a well-equipped surgical theater, nothing more. Grisham explained the high mortality rate as an unfortunate consequence of treating severely ill patients. "I've been attempting advanced treatments for terminal conditions," he told Cartwright. "Heart disease, kidney failure, pulmonary disorders. These patients would have died anyway. I'm simply trying experimental approaches that might, in future, save similar patients." Cartwright examined the facility with a physician's eye. He noted the restraint mechanisms on the surgical table and asked about them. Grisham explained they were for patients in delirium, a reasonable answer. He noted the recovery room beds, also equipped with restraints, and received the same explanation. What Cartwright didn't see were the burial sites, the hidden journals, the preserved tissue samples, or the photographs of subjects who had been healthy before Grisham selected them. Most importantly, Cartwright didn't speak privately with any of the enslaved people at Riverside. He asked Grisham if he could interview some of the survivors to understand what treatments had been attempted. Grisham smoothly suggested that such interviews would be distressing for people still grieving their lost family members. Cartwright accepted this without pressing, because speaking with enslaved people without their owner's permission and supervision wasn't really done in polite society. Cartwright left Riverside that afternoon, satisfied that while Grisham's mortality rates were high, they didn't indicate anything criminal. Aggressive experimental treatment sometimes failed. That was the nature of medicine's cutting edge. He did suggest that Grisham might want to be more selective about which patients he accepted for treatment, perhaps focusing only on cases where conventional medicine had clearly failed. Grisham thanked him for the advice and assured him he would be more judicious going forward. He wasn't. 3 days after Cartwright's visit, Subject 14 was selected. A young man named Joseph, 19 years old, chosen because Grisham had decided teenage subjects might demonstrate optimal recovery potential. The procedure attempted was a kidney transplant using tissue from one of the chimpanzees Grisham had purchased. He had theorized that primates, being closer to humans evolutionarily, might prove more compatible donors than livestock. Joseph survived 36 hours, longer than most subjects. Grisham was encouraged by this, interpreting the extended survival time as evidence that primate tissue was indeed more compatible. His notes reveal a mind that had completely lost touch with moral reality. Subject 14 demonstrated promising vital signs for first 24 hours post-surgery. Tissue rejection began hour 26, with rapid systemic decline thereafter. Conclusion: primate donors show potential. Future attempts should utilize both chimpanzee subjects to maximize available tissue. That's exactly what he did. Over the next 3 weeks, Grisham killed 4 more people in attempts to transplant chimpanzee organs into human subjects. None survived more than 48 hours. By the time both chimpanzees had been used up, subject 18 had died, bringing the total death count to 18 people in just under 6 months. The remaining community at Riverside, now reduced to 25 people, had moved beyond fear into a kind of numb horror. Parents stopped naming their newborns immediately, waiting to see if the child would survive long enough to make a name worth giving. People stopped making plans beyond the next day. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical deaths. Every morning that someone woke up still alive felt less like blessing and more like temporary reprieve from inevitable execution. Sarah, Marcus's wife, tried to maintain something like normal life for their 2 daughters. She sang to them at night, told them stories, taught them the songs her grandmother had taught her. But she also prepared them for the possibility that one or both parents might be taken. "If something happens to me and your papa," she told her oldest daughter, a girl of 11 named Grace, "you take care of your sister. You remember everything we taught you. You survive. You hear me? You survive." Grace nodded, understanding far more than a child should have to understand. She had watched 18 people disappear into that medical building. She had attended 18 quiet burials. She understood that survival wasn't guaranteed, that tomorrow wasn't promised, that the man with the notebook could choose anyone, anytime, for any reason. Grisham's selection criteria had evolved in disturbing ways by summer 1851. He had moved beyond simply choosing subjects based on health or age. He had started selecting people based on what he called anatomical optimization, measuring them against the animals he had available. He would walk through the quarters with a measuring tape, recording heights, weights, chest circumferences. He would listen to heartbeats and lung sounds, comparing them to similar measurements he had taken from his livestock. He was matching humans to animals like someone selecting fabric swatches to coordinate with furniture. Subject 19 was a teenage girl named Lily, 16 years old, selected because her physical dimensions closely matched one of the young pigs Grisham had recently acquired. The surgery, performed on June 29th, attempted a double lung transplant. Lily died on the table, never regaining consciousness after the chloroform. Grisham's notes expressed frustration at the premature failure and hypothesized that female adolescent subjects might lack the physiological resilience of male adolescent subjects. He tested that hypothesis with subject 20, a teenage boy named David, also 16. David survived 14 hours. Grisham interpreted this as confirmation of his theory, writing, "Male adolescent subjects demonstrate superior survival duration. Gender appears to be significant variable in transplant tolerance. Future subject selection should prioritize young males for procedures requiring maximum physiological resilience." The cold calculation, the complete absence of any recognition that he was describing children, the matter-of-fact discussion of which demographics died more slowly, all of it revealed a mind that had thoroughly dehumanized the people it was systematically killing. To Grisham, they weren't children with families and futures. They were subjects with variables to be tested and documented. By August 1851, 21 people had died. Marcus, who had managed to keep his family safe through a combination of luck and strategic invisibility, felt time running out. Grisham was working through the community systematically. Eventually, everyone would be chosen. It was only a matter of when. On August 19th, Marcus made a decision that he knew was probably suicidal but felt necessary anyway. He decided to run, not to freedom, That was too far and too impossible with a wife and 2 children. But to Natchez, to find anyone who might listen. Some white person with enough power and enough conscience to intervene. He left after midnight, moving through darkness, using skills he'd learned as a child to avoid detection. He made it to Natchez by dawn, exhausted and terrified. He knew that as a black man without traveling papers, he could be stopped and questioned at any moment. He needed to find help quickly. He made his way to the offices of a lawyer he had heard about, a man named Benjamin Holland, who had a reputation for occasionally taking cases involving enslaved people's treatment. Holland wasn't an abolitionist. He believed in slavery as an institution, but he also believed that there were limits to acceptable behavior even within that brutal system. Marcus waited outside Holland's office until it opened. When Holland arrived, Marcus approached him directly, speaking quickly, knowing he might not get another chance. "Sir, my name is Marcus. I'm from Riverside Manor. Dr. Grisham is killing people there. 21 people dead in 8 months. He calling it medical research, but he experimenting on us, cutting us open, putting animal parts inside us. We dying, all of us. Someone got to stop him." Holland's first instinct was skepticism. The accusation seemed fantastical, but something in Marcus's demeanor, the specific details, the desperation that was clearly genuine, made him pause. "These are serious accusations," Holland said carefully. "Do you have any evidence?" "He keeps notes," Marcus replied. "A journal. He writes in it all the time. And he takes photographs before each surgery. And he saves pieces of people in glass jars. It all in that building he built. But you gotta come look without telling him first, because if he knows you coming, he'll hide everything." Holland was in a difficult position. He couldn't simply barge onto a white man's property on the word of an enslaved person without permission. But the accusation was serious enough that he felt obligated to investigate. He told Marcus to wait, went inside his office, and spent an hour composing a letter to the county sheriff, a man named William Patterson. The letter carefully laid out Marcus's accusations without vouching for their truth. Holland emphasized that while the claims seemed extraordinary, they were specific enough to warrant investigation. He particularly noted the allegation about documented evidence. If Grisham was keeping journals and photographs, that could be verified. Sheriff Patterson received the letter that afternoon. His response would determine whether Grisham's operation would be stopped or whether it would continue unchecked until every person at Riverside was dead. Sheriff William Patterson was not a man easily moved by accusations against respectable white citizens. He had held his position for 11 years, and in that time he had learned that maintaining order in a slave society meant supporting the authority of property owners, even when their behavior raised eyebrows. But Holland's letter troubled him enough that he decided to make what he called a courtesy visit to Riverside Manor. The critical mistake Patterson made was one of protocol. He sent word to Grisham that he would be visiting on August 28th to discuss some questions that had arisen about the medical facility. He framed it as routine, nothing accusatory, just a sheriff making sure everything was in order. This advance notice gave Grisham 9 days to prepare. Those 9 days proved fatal for Marcus. When Grisham learned that someone had gone to the authorities with accusations, he demanded that Luther Briggs identify who had left the plantation without permission. It didn't take long to determine that Marcus was missing. When Marcus returned to Riverside 3 days after his meeting with Holland, believing he had set events in motion that might save his family, he walked directly into Grisham's trap. Grisham had Marcus seized immediately, but he didn't have him beaten or killed, which was what everyone expected. Instead, Grisham did something more calculated. He announced that Marcus had attempted to run away, a serious offense, and as punishment, Marcus would receive corrective medical treatment for what Grisham diagnosed as a mental disorder causing criminal behavior. The enslaved community understood exactly what this meant. Marcus was going to become Subject 22, and there was nothing anyone could do to prevent it, Sarah begged. She literally got on her knees in front of Grisham and begged him to spare her husband. She offered to take Marcus's place. She promised Marcus would never cause trouble again. Grisham listened to her pleas with the same clinical detachment he brought to everything, then had Briggs remove her from his presence. On August 24th, 4 days before Sheriff Patterson's scheduled visit, Marcus was taken to the medical facility. Grisham's notes on Subject 22 are particularly chilling because they reveal his awareness that this subject had tried to expose him. Subject 22. Male, approximately 34 years, excellent physical condition. Subject demonstrated seditious behavior, requiring disciplinary response through medical intervention. Proceeding with comprehensive organ study. Multiple transplantation sites to maximize data collection from single subject. What Grisham did to Marcus was worse than what he had done to anyone before. He kept Marcus alive for 3 days, performing not one procedure but several, treating him like a living laboratory to test multiple transplant sites simultaneously. The notes document kidney replacement, liver tissue grafting, and attempts at vascular system modifications, all on the same person over a 72-hour period. Marcus died on August 27th at 2 in the morning. His body was buried in the unmarked graves with the other 21 victims. When Sarah was told her husband had died from complications during treatment, she didn't scream or cry. She simply stopped speaking. She would remain silent for the next 3 weeks, caring for her daughters in complete silence, her voice taken by grief too profound for words. Sheriff Patterson arrived at Riverside on August 28th, accompanied by a deputy. Grisham greeted them with Southern hospitality, offering refreshments and expressing puzzlement about why a visit was necessary. Patterson explained that he had received concerning reports about mortality rates at the plantation. "I'm aware there have been rumors," Grisham said smoothly. "Unfortunately, I've been attempting to treat severely ill patients using experimental techniques. Advanced medicine sometimes fails, Sheriff. It's the nature of pushing boundaries." Patterson asked to see the medical facility. Grisham graciously agreed, having spent the previous 9 days preparing for exactly this moment. The surgical theater was immaculate. The restraint mechanisms were explained as necessary for delirious patients. The recovery room beds looked like any hospital beds, their straps barely visible. The animals had been moved to a distant barn. The most damning evidence, Grisham's journals and the photographs and tissue samples, were hidden in a secret compartment he had built beneath the floorboards of his personal study in the main house. "May I speak with some of the people who work here?" Patterson asked. "Get their perspective on the medical treatments?" "Of course," Grisham replied, "though I should mention that the recent death of one of their community members has them quite distraught. Grief can make people say irrational things. This preemptive framing was strategic. If anyone made accusations, Grisham had already planted the seed that they were emotionally unstable and unreliable." Patterson interviewed 3 people, including Sarah. But the interviews were conducted in the presence of Luther Briggs, which meant no one dared speak freely. When Patterson asked Sarah about her husband's death, she stared at the ground and said nothing. Her silence spoke volumes, but it wasn't evidence. It was just the grief of an enslaved woman who had lost her husband, something that happened often enough in that world that it didn't raise particular alarm. Patterson left Riverside that afternoon feeling vaguely unsettled but unable to identify anything specifically criminal. Grisham's explanations were plausible. High mortality rates in experimental medicine weren't unusual. The facility looked professional. And without any hard evidence or willing witnesses, there was nothing to pursue. He wrote a brief report concluding that while Dr. Grisham's mortality rates were concerning, they didn't appear to constitute criminal activity. The report was filed and forgotten. Marcus had died trying to save his community, and his death had accomplished nothing. Grisham understood that he had narrowly avoided exposure. A less careful man might have been cautious after such a close call. But Grisham was not cautious. He was emboldened. The authorities had investigated and found nothing. He had been validated in his mind. His work could continue. 3 days after Patterson's visit, Subject 23 was selected. A woman named Ruth, 41 years old, who Grisham noted had excellent cardiovascular health for her age, making her ideal for cardiac tissue studies. Ruth survived 18 hours after Grisham attempted to graft horse heart tissue onto her existing heart. Her death brought the toll to 23 people in just over 9 months. The community at Riverside, now reduced to 19 people, had passed beyond hope. They understood that no one was coming to save them. The authorities had investigated and done nothing. They were on their own, and being on your own in slavery meant being powerless. Sarah finally spoke again after Ruth's death. Her first words in 3 weeks were directed at her oldest daughter, Grace. "When I'm gone," she said quietly, "you take your sister and you survive. However you gotta do it, you survive. Don't matter what they call it or how they explain it. You just survive." Grace was 11 years old and understood that her mother was preparing her for inevitable orphanhood. The realization that her mother, the one constant in her terrifying world, expected to be killed, broke something in the child. But she nodded and promised she would survive. Because that's what you did. You survived until you couldn't anymore. Grisham's journal entries from September through November 1851 show a mind that had descended into complete obsession. The repeated failures weren't discouraging him. They were refining what he saw as his methodology. He had begun formulating theories about why every transplant failed. Theories that had no basis in medical reality, but that he pursued with single-minded determination. He theorized that the problem might be timing, that organs needed to be transplanted within specific time frames to remain viable. He began performing surgeries with increasing speed, trying to minimize the time between removing organs from donor animals and installing them in human subjects. This just meant people died faster, but he interpreted their quicker deaths as evidence that he was eliminating variables. He theorized that the problem might be age matching, that donor animals needed to be the same approximate age as the human subjects. He began purchasing younger and younger livestock, lambs instead of sheep, piglets instead of grown hogs. The deaths continued, and he simply moved to the next theory. He theorized that the problem might be organ matching, that certain organs from certain animals might be more compatible with humans. He attempted kidney transplants from horses, lung transplants from young cattle, liver grafts from goats. Each variation ended in death, and each death was documented with the same clinical language that treated human suffering as data points in an experiment. Subject 24 was a man named Benjamin, 28 years old, selected in late October. Grisham had decided to attempt what he called a comprehensive systemic approach, transplanting multiple organs from a single donor animal into a single human subject to test whether species consistency improved compatibility. Benjamin received kidney and liver tissue from the same young pig. He survived 22 hours before his body's complete rejection of the foreign tissue caused systemic organ failure. Grisham's notes expressed frustration that the extended survival time still hadn't allowed for successful tissue integration. The 25th and final victim was chosen on November 4th, 1852. Her name was Sarah, Marcus's widow, the woman who had tried to save her husband and had spent the last 15 months watching her community be systematically destroyed. Grisham selected her with deliberate cruelty, noting in his journal that her prolonged grief state may have compromised immune function, providing opportunity to study transplant rejection in subjects with depressed constitutional health. Sarah knew she was going to die. She had known since Marcus's death that eventually Grisham would select her. She spent her last day with her daughters, 11-year-old Grace and 8-year-old Ruth, named after the woman who had died months before. She told them she loved them. She gave Grace all the instructions she could think of for how to survive. She sang them the songs her grandmother had taught her. And then, when Luther Briggs came to take her to the medical facility that evening, she kissed both girls goodbye and walked away without looking back. If she had looked back, she wouldn't have been able to leave them, and leaving was no longer her choice to make. The procedure performed on Sarah involved attempting to transplant sheep lung tissue, the same procedure that had killed Lily and several others. Grisham had apparently decided to return to earlier approaches, testing whether repeated attempts at the same procedure might yield different results. They didn't. Sarah died at dawn on November 5, 1852, 23 hours after surgery. She was buried next to her husband in the unmarked graves that now held 25 bodies. Her daughters, orphaned and alone, were absorbed into the remaining households at Riverside. Grace took responsibility for her younger sister exactly as her mother had instructed. She was 11 years old, and she had already learned that survival meant carrying grief without speaking it, holding terror without showing it, and continuing to function even when everything inside you was screaming. Grisham's final journal entry after Subject 25's death reveals something unexpected. He stopped. After 25 deaths in 22 months, after systematically killing more than half the enslaved population at Riverside, he simply stopped experimenting. The final entry reads, Subject 25 failed to demonstrate successful tissue integration despite optimal surgical technique and careful subject selection. 25 attempts utilizing varying donor species, organ types, subject demographics, and procedural modifications have yielded no successful transplantations. Conclusion: current medical knowledge insufficient to support viable organ transplantation. Preserving all documentation and tissue samples for future researchers who may possess superior understanding of physiological mechanisms. Research programs suspended pending advances in surgical science. He didn't stop because of moral awakening. He didn't stop because of guilt or conscience. He stopped because he had concluded that the science wasn't advanced enough yet. He believed that future generations, with better knowledge, would vindicate his approach. He was preserving evidence not to confess his crimes, but to claim credit for pioneering work that was ahead of its time. The remaining 18 people at Riverside, the survivors of Grisham's 2-year program of systematic killing, found themselves in a bizarre situation. The terror that had dominated every moment of their lives for nearly 2 years simply stopped. Grisham returned to a more conventional plantation operation, hiring field workers from Natchez to cultivate cotton since his enslaved population had been too depleted to maintain the crops. He still owned them. He still had absolute power over their lives, but he no longer prowled through the quarters with his notebook, no longer measured and observed and selected. The medical facility sat empty, its surgical table unused, its windows dark at night. The fear didn't leave. You don't recover from that kind of trauma quickly, but the immediate, pressing terror of selection faded into something more like constant, low-level dread. Grace grew up in that atmosphere. She turned 12, then 13, then 14, carrying the weight of everything she had witnessed. She never spoke about her parents' deaths except to tell her sister Ruth the bare minimum, that their father had tried to help and their mother had been brave. The details, the horror of what had actually happened in that medical facility, she kept locked inside because there was nowhere safe to speak them. Grisham continued his medical practice in Natchez, treating the white elite and maintaining his reputation as a skilled, if somewhat eccentric, physician. He never spoke publicly about his research at Riverside. He never published papers about his experiments. But he carefully preserved all his documentation, his journals, his photographs, his tissue samples, storing them in a locked medical case that he kept in his private study. He married in 1854, a woman 30 years his junior who knew nothing about what he had done. They had 3 children together. He became a respected member of Natchez society, known for his medical skill and his generous donations to various charitable causes. The people of Riverside, the survivors who knew what he really was, had no voice to contradict his public image. They were property. Their testimony meant nothing in a court of law. Their trauma was invisible to the white world. Grisham died in 1866, 4 years after slavery's end, of a stroke that killed him quickly. He was 67 years old. His wife and children inherited his estate, including Riverside Manor, which they sold within a year. The new owners had no interest in maintaining the plantation and divided the property for sale to multiple buyers. The medical facility, that building where 25 people had died, was demolished in 1868. The lumber was salvaged for other construction projects. The foundation was filled in. Within a few years, there was no physical evidence that the building had ever existed. The survivors scattered after emancipation. Grace, 19 years old when freedom came, took her 15-year-old sister Ruth and traveled to Vicksburg, where they found work and built new lives. Grace married, had children, and lived until 1923, dying at age 83. She never told her children or grandchildren about what had happened at Riverside. The trauma was too deep, too painful, and she saw no purpose in passing that horror to the next generation. The story should have ended there. A crime committed, never prosecuted, gradually forgotten as the survivors died and memory faded. But Grisham's compulsion to document his work, his certainty that history would vindicate him, meant that the evidence survived, even when the witnesses did not. When his widow died in 1881, the estate was settled by his adult children, who had no knowledge of their father's crimes. They sold Riverside Manor to new owners, and among the possessions that were moved from the main house was a locked leather medical case. The new owners, finding it locked and assuming it contained ordinary medical supplies, stored it in the servants' quarters without opening it. The case sat there for 8 years, forgotten and undisturbed. Until October 3, 1889, when a kitchen fire broke out. When firefighters tore down a smoke-damaged wall to prevent the fire's spread, They found that case. And when they finally forced it open, they discovered 25 glass vials containing preserved tissue samples, 25 daguerreotype photographs of terrified faces, and several journals documenting exactly what Dr. Nathaniel Grisham had done to 25 human beings in the name of medical science. The fire chief who discovered the case, Robert Caldwell, immediately contacted the county sheriff. The sheriff contacted the state attorney general's office, and within days, an investigation was launched into crimes that had been committed nearly 4 decades earlier. The investigation that began in November 1889 had to reconstruct events from nearly 40 years earlier. Most of the people directly involved were dead. Grisham had been in his grave for 23 years. Luther Briggs, the overseer who had carried out Grisham's orders, had died in 1872. Many of the survivors had scattered after emancipation, their current whereabouts unknown. But the evidence Grisham had so carefully preserved told the story with horrifying clarity. The journals were the most damning. Page after page of clinical observations documenting systematic human experimentation. Each entry began with subject, followed by a number, detailing the person's approximate age, physical condition, the procedure performed, and the time of death. The language was coldly professional, but what it described was murder disguised as research. The photographs provided faces to match the numbers. 25 daguerreotypes showing men, women, and teenagers standing in Grisham's surgical theater. Some looked directly at the camera with expressions ranging from confusion to fear. Others stared at the floor, unable or unwilling to meet the lens. In several images, you could see the restraint table in the background, a chilling preview of what awaited each subject after the photograph was taken. The tissue samples in their glass vials were the physical evidence of what Grisham had done. Each vial was labeled with a subject number, a date, and notes about what organ or tissue it contained. They were Grisham's attempt to preserve his research for future scientists who might understand what he had tried to accomplish. Instead, they became evidence of crimes that shocked even a society that had tolerated slavery. The Mississippi Attorney General, a man named Thomas Harrison, took personal charge of the investigation. He understood that this case raised profound questions about justice, accountability, and how society confronts historical atrocities. Grisham was beyond earthly prosecution, but Harrison believed the story needed to be told completely and officially documented. He assigned 2 investigators to locate any surviving witnesses. This proved extraordinarily difficult. The enslaved community at Riverside had been scattered for nearly 4 decades. Many had moved multiple times since emancipation. Some had changed their names, a common practice among formerly enslaved people creating new identities and freedom. Some had died, and some simply didn't want to be found, having built new lives and having no desire to relive the horrors of their past. But the investigators were persistent. Using old plantation records, census data, and community networks within black churches and mutual aid societies, they gradually located 7 survivors. 7 people who had been at Riverside Manor between 1851 and 1852, who had witnessed Grisham's systematic killing, who had carried that trauma for nearly 40 years. The first survivor located was Grace, Marcus and Sarah's daughter, now 50 years old and living in Vicksburg. When the investigators appeared at her door in December 1889, explaining why they had come, Grace's first instinct was to turn them away. She had spent 37 years trying not to think about Riverside. She had built a life, raised children, created something resembling peace. The thought of opening those memories felt unbearable, but the investigators explained that this might be the only chance for the truth to be officially recorded, that the people who had died, including her parents, might finally be acknowledged, that what had happened at Riverside could be documented in a way that prevented it from being forgotten or dismissed as rumor. Grace agreed to speak with them. The interview took place over 2 days in January 1890. She described what she remembered as an 11-year-old child watching her community be systematically destroyed. She described her father trying to get help and being killed for it. She described her mother preparing her daughters for inevitable orphanhood. And she described the atmosphere of terror that had dominated every moment of those 22 months. "You couldn't trust tomorrow," Grace told the investigators, her voice steady despite the tears running down her face. "Every morning you woke up, you didn't know if this was the day Dr. Grisham would choose you or someone you loved. We all knew people were dying in that building. We could hear sounds at night. We'd see him writing in that book, watching people, measuring them like they were livestock, and then they'd be gone. We'd be told they died from sickness despite his best efforts to save them. We knew it was lies. But what could we do? We were property. He owned us. He could do whatever he wanted, and there was no law protecting us, no authority that cared. The investigators asked if she could identify any of the victims from the photographs. Grace looked through the daguerreotypes, and the experience clearly devastated her. "This is Hannah," she said, pointing to the first photograph. She was kind. She used to tell us stories. "This is Elijah. He was good at making things, could fix anything. This is my grandfather, Isaac. He tried to warn everyone what Dr. Grisham was. This is my father, Marcus." Her voice broke. "He tried to save us. He went to Natchez to find help. And they killed him for it. This is my mother, Sarah. She survived my father by 15 months, and every day of those months she was waiting to be chosen." She identified 17 of the 25 victims by name. The other 8 were people she had been too young to know well, or who had been at Riverside for a shorter time. But 17 names were more than had existed in any official record. Hannah, Elijah, Isaac, Joseph, Lily, David, Ruth, Benjamin, Marcus, Sarah, and 7 others whose names Grace spoke aloud, perhaps for the first time in decades. 6 other survivors were located over the following months. Each was interviewed, and each provided additional details that corroborated Grisham's journals and expanded the understanding of what had occurred at Riverside. A man named Daniel, now 69 years old and living in Jackson, described the community meetings where people tried to figure out how to survive. A woman named Martha, 63, described watching her brother die after being selected as Subject 17. Each testimony added layers to a story that was becoming impossible to dismiss or minimize. The investigation's findings were compiled into a comprehensive report released in August 1890. The report included extensive quotes from Grisham's journals, testimony from the 7 survivors, medical analysis of what Grisham had attempted to do, and a legal examination of how such atrocities had been permitted under slavery's legal framework. The medical analysis, conducted by 3 prominent physicians, concluded that every procedure Grisham attempted was guaranteed to fail with 1850s medical knowledge. Organ transplantation required understanding of immunology, blood typing, tissue compatibility, and immunosuppressive drugs, none of which existed in Grisham's time. Even if his surgical technique had been perfect, even if his subjects had been willing participants, every transplant would have resulted in death because the human body rejects foreign tissue. The victims died for nothing, not for medical advancement, not for knowledge that might help others. They died because one man with absolute power over them had pursued an obsession without regard for their humanity or suffering. The legal analysis was equally damning, but in different ways. The report concluded that while Grisham's actions were morally monstrous, they had been technically legal under Mississippi's slavery laws in the 1850s. Enslaved people were classified as property. Property owners had broad authority to use their property as they saw fit. Medical experimentation on enslaved people without consent was not explicitly prohibited. The law provided no protection for people who weren't recognized as having rights worth protecting. This legal reality meant that even if Grisham had been alive, prosecution would have been difficult. The crimes had occurred under a legal system that didn't classify them as crimes. This aspect of the report generated enormous controversy. How could systematic murder not be criminal? The answer, uncomfortable as it was, lay in the fundamental injustice of slavery itself. A system that classified human beings as property inevitably enabled atrocities because it removed the legal recognition of humanity. The report's publication created a national scandal. Newspapers across the country covered the story, though with varying levels of sympathy. Northern papers tended to present it as further evidence of slavery's inherent evil, using Grisham's crimes to argue for stronger civil rights protections for Black Americans in the post-Reconstruction South. Southern papers were more defensive, some arguing that Grisham was an isolated aberration who didn't represent the South, others suggesting that the whole story was being exaggerated for political purposes. Medical journals engaged in intense debates about professional ethics and accountability. The American Medical Association, which had been founded in 1847, the same year Grisham began his experiments, issued a statement condemning his actions as reprehensible, violations of medical ethics that brought shame upon the profession. But critics pointed out that the AMA had been silent about experimentation on enslaved people when such practices were occurring. Retrospective condemnation was easy. Where had medical ethics been when it might have made a difference? The Mississippi legislature convened a special commission to examine how such crimes had gone unpunished. The commission's hearings in late 1890 included testimony from historians, medical professionals, and 3 of the survivors, including Grace. Her testimony before the legislature was particularly powerful. "You want to understand how this happened?" she said, her voice cutting through the legislative chamber. "It happened because we weren't considered human beings worthy of protection. Dr. Grisham could do what he did because the law said he owned us, and owners can do what they want with their property. Sheriff Patterson investigated in 1851 and found nothing wrong because he wasn't looking at murdered people. He was looking at damaged property, and even that wasn't enough to stop it. My father died trying to get someone to care. My mother died knowing no one would save her. 25 people died because this state built a legal system that said their lives didn't matter. You can condemn Dr. Grisham now, 40 years later, when it cost you nothing. But what are you going to do about the system that enabled him?" The question hung in the air unanswered. The commission eventually produced a report that condemned Grisham's actions, recommended better historical documentation of slavery's crimes, and suggested educational programs to ensure future generations understood what had occurred. But it offered no reparations to survivors, no financial compensation, no official apology. Grace and the other survivors received nothing except acknowledgement that yes, this had happened, and yes, it was wrong. The sealed room covered this story extensively during the investigation and its aftermath, and we've returned to it multiple times over the years because it raises questions that remain relevant. How do we reckon with historical atrocities? What accountability is possible when the perpetrators are dead? How do we honor victims whose suffering was deliberately hidden? These aren't just historical questions. They're questions we still struggle with today. The site where Riverside Manor once stood became a point of controversy. The land had been divided and sold to multiple owners. Some wanted to erect a memorial. Others argued that bringing attention to the property would damage land values. After years of debate, a small marker was finally placed in 1895 at what had been the plantation's entrance. The marker's text was deliberately understated, noting that a plantation once operated on this site where tragic events occurred between 1851 and 1852. It didn't specify what those tragic events were. It didn't name Grisham. It didn't mention that 25 people had been systematically killed. The memorial was designed to acknowledge just enough to satisfy critics while obscuring enough to avoid discomfort. Grace campaigned for a more explicit memorial. She wrote letters to newspapers, spoke at churches, testified before local government bodies. She argued that the victims deserved to be named, that what happened deserved to be specified, that history should be told clearly rather than euphemistically. She was largely ignored. The prevailing attitude was that dwelling on such horrors served no purpose, that it was better to move forward than to obsess over past tragedies. Grace died in 1923 at age 83. Her obituary in the Vicksburg newspaper mentioned that she had been a survivor of difficult circumstances during slavery, but didn't detail what those circumstances were. Her grandchildren knew she had been enslaved as a child, but knew few specifics. She had spent the last 30 years of her life trying to ensure the story was told and remembered. But by the time of her death, interest had faded. The investigation's findings were filed in state archives. The newspapers that had covered the story moved on to other scandals. The world's attention shifted elsewhere. For decades, Grisham's crimes existed primarily in archived reports that few people read. The story was occasionally mentioned in academic works about medical ethics or slavery's horrors, but it never achieved widespread recognition. The victims remained largely anonymous, known by number rather than name, their individual stories reduced to brief entries in Grisham's clinical notes. That began to change in the 1980s, when historians researching medical experimentation on enslaved people rediscovered the Mississippi investigation reports. They recognized that Grisham's case was one of the most thoroughly documented examples of systematic medical experimentation under slavery. The preserved journals, photographs, and testimony provided a rare, complete picture of such crimes. New research identified additional victims' names through plantation records and cross-referencing with the survivors' testimony. By 1992, historians had identified 22 of the 25 victims by name. The 3 who remained anonymous were people who had been at Riverside for such a short time before being killed that even the survivors couldn't provide their names. A more comprehensive memorial was finally erected in 1994, 143 years after the first murder. This memorial, located in a county park near the former plantation site, lists the names of the 22 identified victims and acknowledges 3 unnamed individuals. It describes what happened in clear language. Dr. Nathaniel Grisham conducted medical experiments on enslaved people at Riverside Manor between 1851 and 1852. 25 men, women, and children died as a result of these experiments. They died without consent, without anesthesia, without hope of survival. They died because the legal system classified them as property rather than persons. Their names deserve remembrance. Their suffering demands acknowledgement. The memorial includes Grace's testimony about her parents. My father Marcus tried to save us and was killed for trying. My mother Sarah died brave. They deserved better than this. We all deserved better than this. Grisham's medical case, with its vials and photographs and journals, is now housed in the Mississippi State Archives under restricted access. Researchers can view the materials under supervision, and the journals have been fully digitized and transcribed. The photographs have been reproduced in several academic works, always with content warnings about their disturbing nature. Looking at those photographs today is a profound experience. You see real people, individuals with their own thoughts and feelings and lives, captured moments before their deaths. You see a teenage boy, possibly David or Joseph, looking confused as if he doesn't understand why he's being photographed. You see a woman, possibly Ruth or Sarah, staring at the camera with an expression of weary resignation. You see Marcus, Grace's father, standing straight despite the fear visible in his eyes. Each photograph is a window into a moment of terror, preserved by the man who would shortly kill the person in the image. The ethics of displaying these photographs remains debated. Some argue they should be widely shared to ensure people understand the reality of what occurred. Others argue that sharing them violates the victim's dignity, that they were photographed without consent as part of their victimization, and that continuing to display those images perpetuates that violation. There's no easy answer. The victims deserve to be remembered as individuals, not numbers. But they also deserve dignity, and it's unclear whether using photographs taken by their murderer serves that goal. Grisham's descendants, his great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, have had to reckon with their family history. Some have issued public statements condemning their ancestors' actions and expressing support for memorialization efforts. Others have remained silent, apparently preferring not to engage with a history they didn't choose and can't change. None of them bear personal responsibility for Grisham's crimes, but they have inherited the complicated legacy of being related to someone who committed atrocities. The broader question of how society should remember and respond to historical crimes like Grisham's remains unresolved. We cannot prosecute the dead. We cannot restore life to the victims. We cannot undo the trauma inflicted on survivors and their descendants. What we can do is ensure the story is told accurately and completely, that the victims are remembered as individuals rather than statistics, and that we examine how legal and social systems enabled such crimes so we can work to prevent similar atrocities in the future. Medical ethics has evolved significantly since Grisham's time. The Nuremberg Code, established after World War II in response to Nazi medical experiments, created international standards for ethical human research. These standards require informed consent, minimize harm, and recognize the inherent dignity of all research subjects. The Tuskegee study revelations in 1972 led to additional protections, particularly for vulnerable populations. Modern medical research operates under institutional review boards that scrutinize proposed studies for ethical concerns. But these protections exist because of historical abuses like Grisham's. They were written in response to suffering, built on foundations of people who died without consent in experiments that treated them as less than human. The victims at Riverside Manor, like countless others subjected to non-consensual medical experimentation, paid with their lives for standards that came too late to save them. The story of Dr. Nathaniel Grisham and his 25 victims forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about history. This wasn't ancient history. This happened less than 200 years ago. People who survived Grisham's killing program lived into the 20th century. Grace, who watched her parents murdered, died less than 100 years ago. This is living memory, not distant past, and this wasn't an isolated incident. Grisham was documented and investigated, but how many similar crimes occurred without leaving evidence? How many other physicians with absolute power over enslaved people conducted experiments that were never discovered? How many victims died without anyone documenting their names or preserving their stories? We'll never know the full scope of medical experimentation under slavery, because so much was deliberately hidden or simply went undocumented. What we do know is that Grisham's crimes were enabled by systemic dehumanization. A society that classified people as property inevitably enabled atrocities because it removed the legal and moral framework that normally constrains violence. Individual evil existed in the person of Nathaniel Grisham, but systematic evil existed in the laws and social structures that gave him power and provided no protection for his victims. Grace spent the last decades of her life insisting that people understand this distinction. In an interview conducted in 1920, 3 years before her death, she said, "Dr. Grisham was a monster, but he was a monster that this country created and enabled. He wasn't some outsider who snuck in and did terrible things. He was a respected physician who owned property and participated in society. People knew something was wrong at Riverside. They investigated and did nothing, because we didn't matter enough to protect. You want to make sure this never happens again? Then you got to change the systems that made it possible, not just condemn the individual who took advantage of those systems." Her words remain relevant. Historical atrocities don't occur in vacuums. They occur in contexts where certain lives are valued less than others, where power is concentrated without accountability, where legal systems fail to protect the vulnerable. Studying Grisham's crimes isn't just about understanding past evil. It's about recognizing the conditions that enable such evil and working to ensure those conditions don't recur. The 25 people who died at Riverside Manor deserved better than they received. They deserved to be seen as human beings with inherent worth. They deserved medical care that prioritized their well-being rather than treating them as experimental subjects. They deserved legal protection against abuse. They deserved to live full lives, raise their families, pursue their own goals and dreams. Instead, they got Nathaniel Grisham. They got a man who saw them as opportunities for research. They got procedures that were guaranteed to fail, performed without real anesthesia or consent. They got clinical notes that referred to them by number rather than name, that documented their suffering with detached precision, that treated their deaths as disappointments in an ongoing experiment rather than as tragedies. Hannah, the first victim, had chronic headaches. Instead of receiving treatment for pain management, she died on Grisham's table while he attempted to graft sheep heart tissue into her chest. Elijah had a limp from an old injury. Instead of receiving care for his leg, he died with a pig's kidney where his own kidney should have been. Isaac warned everyone what Grisham was and died with pig liver tissue grafted into his abdomen. Marcus tried to save his community and was tortured for 3 days before being allowed to die. Sarah survived her husband by 15 months, knowing she would eventually be selected, and finally was. 25 people, each with their own story, each deserving so much more than what they received. So what do we take from this? What does remembering these events accomplish beyond acknowledging horror? I think several things. First, we honor the victims by ensuring their suffering wasn't completely in vain, that it at least contributes to our understanding of how to prevent similar atrocities. Second, we recognize that progress in areas like medical ethics came at enormous cost, paid by people who never chose to make that sacrifice. Third, we remind ourselves that systems matter, that individual evil is dangerous, but systematic injustice is catastrophic, and that building just societies requires constant vigilance and willingness to protect the vulnerable. And finally, we remember that these were real people, not statistics, not abstract victims, but individuals with names and families and lives that mattered. When we reduce them to numbers, we complete the dehumanization that Grisham began. When we remember them as people, when we speak their names, when we tell their stories, we restore a small measure of the humanity that was taken from them: Hannah, Elijah, Isaac, Joseph, Lily, David, Ruth, Benjamin, Marcus, Sarah, and the others whose names we've recovered, and the 3 whose names remain lost to history. They mattered. Their lives had value. Their suffering deserves acknowledgement. Their stories deserve to be told. This is one of those stories that stays with you. I've spent weeks researching this, Reading through those archived journals with their clinical descriptions of torture, looking at those photographs of terrified faces, and it haunts me. It should haunt us, not in a way that paralyzes, but in a way that motivates. Motivated to build a world where such crimes are impossible, where every person is protected, where power is checked by accountability, and where we learn from history's horrors rather than repeating them. What do you think about this? How do we properly memorialize victims of historical atrocities? Should medical schools teach this history as part of ethics education? How do we ensure that vulnerable populations remain protected in modern medical research? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what you're thinking about all of this. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that buried history deserves to be brought into the light, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover another forgotten chapter of history. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. These victims deserve to be remembered. The least we can do is make sure their stories don't disappear again. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous monsters in history weren't supernatural. They were human beings who convinced themselves that their goals justified any means, who operated within systems that enabled their cruelty, and who were allowed to continue because the people they harmed were considered less than human. Understanding how that happened is the first step in making sure it never happens again.